So today I'd like to talk about some of the work I've been conducting under the supervision of Professor Richard Catlow, also in collaboration with Justin Hargreaves from the University of Glasgow and Konstantinos Stanalopouliasti, who did a lot of very good previous computational work in this field. So I'd like to present our work, which is using density functional theory methods to investigate the mechanism of ammonia synthesis on a ternary metal nitride surface. And doing so, we are able to obtain geometries and reaction energy, geometries for key intermediates, transition states. We're able to calculate reaction energies and activation barriers for key elementary processes. And doing so, we gain valuable insights into the strengths and limitations of these materials as catalysts for ammonia synthesis. So I'd like to start just by discussing a bit of background for this project. Ammonia synthesis is absolutely an essential process for the production of fertilizers upon which most of the world depends on to produce enough food. In addition, ammonia is also an important substance for producing, for example, explosives, synthetic fine chemicals containing nitrogen. Ammonia can even be used as an alternative to carbon-based fuels. I believe during the Second World War, buses in Belgium were converted to use ammonia as fuel. And I believe there's ongoing work to investigate the use of ammonia in fuel cells. So for over 100 years, the Haber-Bosch process has been used successfully to produce ammonia using promoted iron-based catalysts. However, there are some limitations to these catalysts. They require very harsh conditions, high temperatures, and high pressures. And the implication of that is that the current ammonia synthesis techniques are very energy demanding. Nearly 2% of global energy consumption goes towards ammonia synthesis. So there are potentially very large gains to be made in developing catalysts that are highly active but can operate under much milder conditions. And to this end, ternary metal nitrides have been identified as promising candidates, as I mentioned, the really good experimental work from our colleagues in Glasgow. In particular, the cobalt molybdenum nitride and iron molybdenum nitride catalysts have been found to be very active, possibly, well, the results show even more active than some of the leading industrial catalysts when suitably promoted. So just to discuss a little bit more about the structure of these materials, they're quite an interesting structure. They are the iron and cobalt molybdenum nitride structures are isostructural, and they have a cubic η-carbide structure. As you can see, so this is the pointer. It's not very good, but you can see this is the bulk structure here. It's rather complex, but we can imagine this is a molybdenum nitride framework. I can't seem to get the pointer to. So it's a molybdenum nitride framework with these metal octamers interlocking. So just focus on a little bit more, we can see the structure of this kind of octahedral arrangement of molybdenum atoms. Nitrogen atoms form this kind of tetrahedral arrangement, and the molybdenum nitride framework consists of these units linking at these nitrogen vertices, whilst the metal, either cobalt or iron, they form these kind of tetrahedral octamer structures. So let's discuss a little bit more about the activity of cobalt molybdenum nitride, which has been investigated in great detail, both experimentally and computationally. So, as I mentioned, it's a very active catalyst for ammonia synthesis. As we see from experimental data from Justin's group, it can even be more active than some of these promoted iron catalysts. So there's a lot of interest in understanding why they are more active. Computational studies using linear scaling relations based on using nitrogen adsorption as a descriptor suggests that the cobalt molybdenum system could be highly active in comparison to ruthenium catalysts have also been found to be highly active. So that's one possibility for the enhanced activity of the cobalt molybdenum nitride, because we have this kind of cobalt molybdenum environment. On the other hand, we also have this alternative possibility of utilizing the activity of lattice nitrogen. So the experimental studies conducted in Justin's group show that cobalt molybdenum nitride loses a substantial amount of nitrogen at high temperatures. Up to 50% of lattice nitrogen can be evolved to the gas phase, and the original Fe3Mo3N system can be regenerated upon introduction of nitrogen as a kind of nitrogen looping material. So if the presence of nitrogen vacancies on the surface could possibly enable a alternative to the more traditional Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism, enabling a Mars van Krevelen type mechanism, which depends on the presence of nitrogen vacancies to provide highly active sites for nitrogen adsorption. So just to review these mechanisms, the traditional Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism is dissociative in nature. Essentially, we start by dissociating nitrogen and sequentially hydrogenating those two nitrogen atoms. So the main challenge then is this initial nitrogen dissociation. The Mars van Krevelen type mechanism is an even type Mars van Krevelen mechanism where we have highly energetic hydrogen from the gas phase that can react with absorbed N2 species to form a hydrazine-like species. Yes, this process here, and then subsequent hydrogenation, which gradually weakens the nitrogen-nitrogen bond until ammonia can be evolved, and essentially the remainder of the process involves hydrogenating what is essentially lattice nitrogen to regenerate the vacancy. So the previous work, as mentioned, the Computational, who was in the audience today, has already done a very detailed study, a computational study, exploring these two mechanisms on the cobalt molybdenum nitride surface. And what we see is that the Mars van Krevelen mechanism does indeed offer an alternative mechanism that lowers the activation balance. This is the black line, because it's overall less energy demanding than the red line, which is the Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism. So, as I mentioned, the surface nitrogen vacancies, they serve as a site for N2 activation, and the hydrogenation of one of those nitrogen atoms takes place before the nitrogen-nitrogen bond association. So we have this associative mechanism, and this provides a nice explanation for the activity of the cobalt molybdenum nitride system. So turning now to the iron molybdenum nitride system. So the iron molybdenum nitride system has been found to be less active than cobalt, but is still highly active. What is very interesting is that the experimental results show that the loss of nitrogen under high temperature conditions is quite minimal compared to cobalt molybdenum nitride. We don't see this massive loss, it's 50% loss of nitrogen as it for iron systems do for cobalt. So this implies then that if there is nitrogen vacancy formation, that it must occur at the surface. So if we think about the cobalt molybdenum nitride surface, in order to have this 50% loss of nitrogen, that must occur at the surface, so there must be some dynamic behavior where subsurface and bulk nitrogen, lattice nitrogen, is able to reach the surface in order to be evolved as nitrogen. If we can form nitrogen vacancies at all on the iron molybdenum nitride surfaces, imply that maybe there's segregation energy or maybe a barrier to nitrogen diffusion throughout the bulk, which prevents this big loss of nitrogen. That's something, of course, that we're going to discuss in the results for the presentation, in this presentation today. So what I'd like to discuss then with the calculation we've done is how does the mechanism for ammonia synthesis compare between the iron and the cobalt molybdenum nitride surfaces? And this is interesting also because the experimental work is focused, in addition to these ternary metal nitrides, also on quaternary cobalt iron molybdenum nitride systems. So we have a very complete understanding of both the cobalt and the iron systems. We might be able to inform rational design of quaternary catalysts that optimizes ammonia synthesis behavior, essentially achieving the best of both worlds, as it were. So the objectives of the study is we're going to investigate the energetics of ammonia synthesis using both the Langmuir-Hinshelwood and Mars van Krevelen mechanisms, and we're going to also investigate the nitrogen vacancy formation energy and compare that with the cobalt molybdenum nitride. So just very briefly, some computational details I mentioned, with these are all plane wave density functional theory calculations within VASP. We use the revised PBE functional, which Computational used for his work on the cobalt molybdenum nitride, is found to well reproduce nitrogen adsorption energy. We use a plane wave cutoff 650 electron volts, capable of sampling 4x4x1. All of this is essentially very similar, the same as what we used for the previous work on the cobalt molybdenum nitride. So we get this direct comparison between these two systems. And our model, again, same as what Computational used for the cobalt molybdenum nitride system. We have a 2x2 supercell consisting of a thin film 1-1-1 surface. It's a nitrogen-rich termination of the 1-1 surface for the iron molybdenum nitride, and that enables us to model those surface processes. So the first thing I'd like to discuss, obviously, a prerequisite to being able to perform ammonia synthesis using Mars van Krevelen mechanism is the formation of surface nitrogen vacancy. So what I've done here is start with the pristine surface, remove a nitrogen atom. I've also looked at the vacancy formation for two adjacent nitrogen vacancies. And we have two different references. One is with respect to gaseous nitrogen, and the other with respect to ammonia and hydrogen. So this is to give an idea of how nitrogen vacancy formation might occur under different conditions, under thermal conditions or under hydrogenation conditions. And what we see is that the vacancy formation energy is indeed endothermic. So for a single vacancy, we've got 1.8. For two vacancies is much higher, 4.2. But per nitrogen vacancy, actually you can see the two adjacent vacancies are only a little bit less than 0.2 electron high. So there is a kind of lateral repulsion between the two vacancies, but it's not a huge quantity. We also see that where we're using the ammonia hydrogen reference, that the vacancy formation energy is much less endothermic. It's possible under appropriate hydrogenation conditions, we could more easily for nitrogen vacancies on the surface. So obviously all these energies are endothermic. We're calculating just simple electronic energies using VFT. Under real conditions, we are accounting for temperature and pressure, also entropy effects, which are going to be important since we're evolving gas phase species from lattice nitrogen, and also configurational entropy arising from the formation of vacancies. These are all things that could possibly enable the formation of a larger number of nitrogen vacancies on the surface. So just to compare the previous result from the cobalt molybdenum nitrides from Computational's paper, we can see these are the relevant values here to compare the ones I've calculated. For the cobalt molybdenum nitride, we still have an endothermic nitrogen vacancy formation energy, 1.68 electron volts compared to 1.89. So indeed, the vacancy formation energy is less endothermic for the cobalt than it is for the iron system, but we can see it's not really a huge amount. So as we know experimentally, we do get a large formation nitrogen vacancy. So again, this implies that it would seem reasonable, not outside the bounds of possibility, that we could have the formation nitrogen vacancies on the surface of the iron molybdenum nitride system, and that could enable this Mars van Krevelen type mechanism, which I'm going to discuss now. So the first process associated with the iridium Mars van Krevelen mechanism is, of course, the adsorption of an N2 molecule in this vacancy site. And what we immediately see is the process is very exothermic, minus 1.75 electron volts. And indeed, this is also the case with cobalt molybdenum nitride, but it is an entire 1 electron volt more exothermic for the iron system. And moreover, we see there's a considerable extent of nitrogen activation with elongation of the N2 bond to 1.32 angstroms compared to 1.09. Although this is comparable with the cobalt molybdenum nitride. And so we can correlate this with the higher endothermicity of the formation of nitrogen vacancy in the first place. That implies that the vacancy site is inherently more active to nitrogen absorption, as indeed what we see with this highly exothermic absorption energy. So the first process then, the hydrogenation, is this iridium type step where we have high energy hydrogen coming in from the gas phase to form this hydrazine-like species. And once again, we can see this is a highly exothermic process, although it's more so for the cobalt molybdenum nitride. We can see here this structure is hydrazine-like intermediate. So in the subsequent process, we model these by considering hydrogenation of this hydrazine-type species with co-adsorbed hydrogen on the surface. So this is where we start to see a bit of a change in behavior. The process is endothermic, but not particularly so, and only has a moderate barrier. The adsorption of hydrogen is exothermic. And this forms this species here. We can see we now have, sorry, I can't quite get the pointer to work, where we have 3 hydrogen atoms, and therefore the next step is the evolution of the first equivalent of ammonia. And we can see this is exothermic, not by very much, it's roughly thermoneutral for the cobalt molybdenum nitride system. So still quite similar behavior. So subsequently, in order to complete the reaction cycle, we need to perform hydrogenation of what is essentially lattice nitrogen. After evolving the first equivalent of ammonia, we basically yield this lattice nitrogen vacancy. And we see here is moderate activation barrier, and the process is exothermic. It's interesting that this is quite a bit different behavior compared to the cobalt molybdenum nitride. In fact, on the cobalt, this process is endothermic by 1 electron volt and has a much higher activation barrier of 1.55 electron volts, which is interesting, given that we see from the calculated vacancy formation energy that would appear initially at least the iron system is more resistant to formation of nitrogen vacancies. On the other hand, we see kind of a reverse behavior for the second hydrogenation here. For the iron system, it's highly endothermic and has a high barrier On the other hand, for the cobalt system, we see we have almost thermoneutral and a moderate activation barrier. So it's interesting, we have this kind of alternating behavior, and I suppose we will do more calculations and more analysis on this, but we can correlate this to the different redox behavior between iron and cobalt having more electron than nitrogen. But of course, there'll be other, it's not quite simple as just keeping track of oxidation states or delocalization throughout the system. On the, and as you can see, these are vacancy as a molybdenum type site. So there'll be more discussion on that in future work. So the final hydrogenation step required to form essentially ammonia on the surface for cobalt. Sorry, for iron, we return to exothermic with the moderate barrier. Again, we see this alternating behavior for the cobalt. The previous hydrogenation process, thermoneutral, had low barrier. Now we've gone back to endothermic with a higher barrier. And of course, the final step is the evolution of the second equivalent of ammonia to yield the slab with this nitrogen vacancy, so complete the catalytic cycle. So you see here, actually, this is very endothermic at 1.27 electron volts, and this is quite comparable to the cobalt molybdenum nitride. So just a very brief summary of this mechanism. This is, the key feature of the nitrides, the ability to utilize nitrogen vacancies to enable this mechanism. And we can see it in general, the mechanism on the cobalt iron molybdenum nitride systems are broadly quite similar, apart from its alternating between low and high barriers. But where we see the rate limiting steps, the highest barriers are quite comparable. One key difference is the initial nitrogen adsorption and activation appears to be enhanced by the iron molybdenum nitride. Again, that correlates with the greater resistance from the, as you can see, from the nitrogen vacancy formation energy of the iron molybdenum nitride surface to vacancy formation. And again, the evolution of the second equivalent of ammonia is more energy demanding rather than the first equivalent, and that again reflects the relative stability of this lattice type nitrogen. So to compare, we need to obviously look at the Langmuir-Hinshelwood type mechanism. And so in this case, rather than placing our nitrogen adsorbate at the vacancy, we place it up this other side, this kind of iron site adjacent. And what's very interesting here for the iron molybdenum nitride system is this process is in fact exothermic, which is different to what we see for the cobalt molybdenum nitride surface. So we've got minus 0.17 compared to plus 0.75. And we also see this nitrogen elongation, even when we're absorbing nitrogen, not at the vacancy, but its adjacent site, so it's 1.359. We do see that to some extent for the cobalt system, if I recall correctly, the elongation of the NN bond for cobalt, for the nitrogen molecule absorbed on the cobalt system in a completely analogous manner. The bond length is about 1.29 angstrom. So it's interesting that we see that we still have this nitrogen activation on the iron molybdenum nitride, even when we're absorbing at a site adjacent to that at the vacancy, and this is enhanced compared to the cobalt molybdenum nitride system. So the first step in the Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism is just this dissociation state, transition state of the N2 molecule. And so we have moderate activation barrier, but the process is exothermic. So it's interesting actually compared to the hydrogenation processes. This, which is traditionally thought of as being the most energy demanding process for traditional ammonia synthesis catalysts, N2 dissociation, actually is something that these catalysts do quite well, even without resorting to this Mars van Krevelen type mechanism. And if we compare to the cobalt molybdenum nitride, actually see this is very exothermic for cobalt and has only a moderate barrier. We must remember the initial nitrogen absorption is endothermic. So that's perhaps one advantage that the iron molybdenum nitride system has over the cobalt. Even though this dissociation process is less exothermic, we can absorb nitrogen. So it's possible that the iron molybdenum nitride surface could well facilitate both of these mechanisms potentially. So, of course, we are proceeding as we have done before with sequential hydrogenation of those nitrogen atoms. And so again, we see this kind of, the main challenge is the hydrogenation of these nitrogen atoms with quite a high barrier, 1.17 electron volts, that's almost thermoneutral. We see pretty similar behavior in terms of the activation barrier, even higher barrier for the cobalt, but it's exothermic. So just want to move on here. So we have the second hydrogenation process, again, another high activation barrier and a slightly endothermic, similar behavior for the cobalt molybdenum nitride, almost thermoneutral, also quite a high activation barrier. And we see that the nitrogen molecule switches its coordination by this kind of iron molybdenum bridging site. And the third hydrogenation process, again, we see quite a high barrier, endothermic, and again, pretty comparable behavior for the cobalt molybdenum nitride. So you can see this is a clear challenge from Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism. All of these initial hydrogenation processes, they're quite activated in comparison to Langmuir-Hinshelwood, sorry, the Mars van Krevelen mechanism that we saw earlier in the presentation. So, of course, once we have formed ammonia on the surface, we have to consider the desorption of the gas phase. Again, this is an energy demanding process at 1.37 electron volts. So again, this is another key difference with the Mars van Krevelen mechanism, where we see the evolution of our first equivalent of ammonia is actually quite easy, but a lot more challenging for the second. So of course, we continue with hydrogenation, the second nitrogen atom. Again, we see quite a bit, somewhat different behavior between the cobalt and the iron, moderate activation barrier and exothermic for the iron system, compared to exothermic, but much higher barrier for the cobalt molybdenum nitride system. And it's interesting to note at this point that we are now starting hydrogen at the second nitrogen atom, and the barrier is actually a bit lower than the corresponding process for the iridium Mars van Krevelen mechanism. And again, that comes back to this kind of greater stability of the surface lattice nitrogen, which is not terribly surprising compared to this system where we have the nitrogen adsorbed adjacent to the vacancy site. So second hydrogenation, the second nitrogen atom, reasonably high barrier, almost thermal neutral. For the cobalts, we see actually much lower barrier and it's exothermic. And we see this behavior continuing, so high barrier 1.27 electron volts and endothermic for the iron compared to the cobalt, also endothermic but much lower barrier. And of course, the final process to regenerate our initial state is this evolution of the second equivalent of ammonia. And again, coming back to this general trend, we see this is endothermic, but not too large energy, and it is much less endothermic compared to the Mars van Krevelen type mechanism. So to summarize all this information, there's a lot of information to take in. I prefer these reaction profiles like Constantinos did with the cobalt system, and we can see these general trends more clearly. So again, we see this general behavior, at least for the initial processes for ammonia synthesis. The iridium Mars van Krevelen mechanism was quite a low energy pathway until we start to get the second hydrogenation process, and this becomes a bit more challenging. On the other hand, whilst we do see enhanced ammonia adsorption and dissociation behavior on the iron molybdenum nitride surface of the cobalt, we still have these high barriers all the way for all of the hydrogenation processes. So it still seems that on the iron molybdenum nitride surface, if we can form nitrogen vacancies, this could be a feasible mechanism for ammonia synthesis. So there's one more thing that I'd like to talk about, to investigate other aspects of this catalyst surface. I've also considered N2 dissociation adjacent vacancies. If you remember back to the start of the talk, we saw the formation of two adjacent nitrogen vacancies is only a little bit more energetically possible than forming two vacancies at great separation. So this is one thing I consider as a possibility, just as more sort of hypothetical approach, as a dissociative Mars van Krevelen type mechanism. And unsurprisingly, we see this is highly exothermic and has quite low barrier. I think also what's more interesting though is the reverse process essentially corresponds to this nitrogen formation and evolution at the surface, which is obviously that's a key process that we'll need to understand the initial formation of those vacancies. So nitrogen atoms must come together. We must have all these adjacent vacancies in the first place in order to evolve nitrogen from the surface. And so again, yes, this is energetically challenging, but it would be very interesting to consider the formation of nitrogen vacancies using through this mechanism, and also the diffusion. So ongoing calculations will examine the diffusion of surface nitrogen atoms across the surface, allowing vacancies to separate. And we might want to consider doing maybe a kinetic Monte Carlo simulation just to better understand the kinetics of nitrogen vacancy formation and diffusion across the surface. So just to conclude and finish up this talk, we see that the surface nitrogen vacancy formation energy on the iron molybdenum nitride surface is energy demanding, but only moderately more so cobalt molybdenum nitride. So we can't rule out the possibility of nitrogen vacancies playing an important role in facilitating this Mars van Krevelen mechanism. As I said, a kinetic Monte Carlo simulation might help that I was discussing with a colleague about maybe moving on to that at some point. What we do see is that if we can form nitrogen vacancies, it's highly activating for the nitrogen molecule, more so than for the cobalt molybdenum nitride. And of course, we also see this activation. The Mars van Krevelen mechanism does allow for these low activation barriers for initial nitrogen hydrogenation, but we do see some greater challenges when we are moving on to hydrogenating the second nitrogen atom, which is essentially a surface lattice nitrogen atom. So that's one thing where, as I mentioned, my train of thought, we saw in the calculated activation barriers kind of alternation between high and low barriers in the cobalt ion system. Moving on in the future, we might want to consider the quaternary system and trying to optimize the behavior by perhaps determining an optimal composition, optimal cobalt to iron ratio. So just for the short term, the ongoing work, we're going to look at this nitrogen vacancy segregation to better understand the experimental results, interpret those experimental results to show that nitrogen vacancy formation, if it occurs at all, must only be confined to the surface, and also going to look at nitrogen or vacancy diffusion with a view to make a second kinetic Monte Carlo simulation to better understand the surface composition under real conditions rather than kind of 0 Kelvin, 0 pressure DFT approach. So just to finish, I'd like to acknowledge my supervisor, Professor Richard Kaplan, for all his support, Professor Justin Hargreaves at Glasgow for some really excellent experimental work, Dr. Konstantin Steynal-Boyasti, who has really been very helpful in getting started this project. For funding, I'd like to thank the UKRI for funding my work and also the Catalysis Hub, as well as all of the HPC clusters that provided computational resources that has enabled us to perform this work. So just to finish up, I would thank you for your attention. I'll try my best to answer any questions.
Thank you, Michael, for being very much ahead of schedule, so that's plenty of time for questions. We'd like to go first. Oh, yeah, up there.
Thanks for a very nice talk. A question: you showed that promotion with, for example, cesium actually increases the rate by orders of magnitude. Yes. I was wondering if you had models how that would affect all the activation, which is nitrogen vacancies.
That's a very good question. The answer is we haven't got there yet. So I'm just going to go back to that slide so we can see those experimental activity values. I mean, essentially, a very good point is understanding how this promotion affects it. And we haven't done that yet because we're starting with this relatively simple model. We need to identify which processes are rate limiting, which are challenging. Let's a couple more slides back. Yes, in doing this work, we are identifying the processes that are the most energy demanding, the most challenging. And I guess future work, we might try to introduce and accommodate some of these promotion effects.
And would you expect the surface to change at all, or the same?
I mean, again, very good question. I mean, I suppose there could be two ways in which the presence of those promoter atoms, so here we are, could affect activity. I guess on the one hand, it could facilitate activity in a more direct way by causing electron structure effects that might lower activation barriers. On the other hand, they might simply facilitate nitrogen vacancy formation. So I don't know the answer to that. I think those are very good questions. That's certainly an option for future work. We could try introducing nitrogen and cesium dopants in relatively small concentrations in our model, either substitutionally or institutionally. That's something I need to discuss with experimentals. And just discussing with Justin a few weeks ago, another promising possibility that emerges, the chromium doping of the iron molybdenum nitride system. So again, that's something we'll look at, and we'll be more able to understand the role of those dopant and promoter atoms once we have a very complete view of the undoped and unpromoted iron molybdenum nitride surface, which we're working towards. Again, very good points.
Just behind you.
Thank you very much for the talk. So two questions. Both quite quick. So first of all, you mentioned as you were going past the associative absorption, hydrogen line, and I just wondered if you could comment on how competitive the hydrogen formation is. And then secondly, building on the conversation, it's simply you talk about the nitrogen vacancies, but generally just these are very crystalline facets. Whether or not stoichiometry might change those operating.
Yeah, those are good questions. I'll answer the second because I've forgotten the first question. But indeed, yes, under operating conditions, I guess for the cobalt molybdenum nitride system, the experimental evidence suggests that there is going to be a big reconstruction of the surface because we do have this massive loss of nitrogen. Experimental evidence for the iron molybdenum nitride system suggests that negligible nitrogen is lost from the bulk. So obviously, in a typical sample, most of the nitrogen is going to be way into the bulk. So that's not inconsistent with surface nitrogen vacancy formation. I would imagine, just perhaps a bit naively, that we wouldn't see any big reconstruction for the iron system, but quite possibly for the cobalt system. So I think the first question is about how is this competitive against, do you mean the adsorption of N2 at this adjacent vacancy site like I did for the...
So the subsequent hydrogenation of the integration.
Oh, okay, so the next slide here.
But so the formation of hydrogen, that was...
Oh, okay, so formation of hydrazine and that dissolving. Okay, that makes more sense. I haven't investigated that, but my suspicion is that at this point, the lattice nitrogens, that second nitrogen atom, I suspect that might be more resistant to hydrogenation. We might see some high barriers or endothermic processes for formation of nitrogen-hydrogen bonds. As we saw from the mechanism that I've computed, for the iron molybdenum nitride system, these, let's say, initial hydrazine lattice formation, subsequent hydrogenation, that happens quite easily, it's quite facile, whereas hydrogenation of the second nitrogen atom, that's a bit more challenging because it sort of resembles lattice nitrogen. So I suspect that's something that we would also see for formation of hydrazine. I think from the experimental evidence, this isn't something that's observed, but again, I've said it's a good question and something we could investigate in more detail. Thanks, Andy, good question.
Thanks, Michael, for the talk. While you got this slide up, it also comes to mind that you might break the NN bond before you make the H break. So there might be a mechanism where you, because on the other mechanism, on Langmuir-Hinshelwood,
Yeah.
You end up with NH2 in like a bridge site.
Yeah, again, that's another good point. We could end up with nitrogen dissociation taking place, and then we sort of end up at the same place that we are with Langmuir-Hinshelwood mechanism.
Yeah.
Again, good point. That's something we could possibly look at. I think that's not unreasonable. I mean, I guess I would need to look in more detail. I mean, I would expect that that process to be more demanding than the evolution of ammonia, simply on the basis that we'd expect nitrogen-nitrogen bonding to be a bit stronger in the species compared to the NH3N species. But again, that's a very good point. That could be another kind of way in which these mechanisms could overlap even.
The thing I was going to ask about is what happens to the oxidation state of the metals as you go through the steps?
Again, that's a very good question. I think that's something we will continue ongoing calculations. Like maybe doing some charge density difference calculations, beta charge analysis calculations, just to track how the oxidation state, local oxidation state changes of those metal atoms. I think coming back to the comparison between the cobalt and the iron, that does appear to be kind of the key difference, where there's extra electron cobalt compared to iron, and we see this kind of alternating between high and low activation barriers. And I think certainly that calculations to investigate the change in oxidation state of local metal environments, that will perhaps shed some light on it. So again, it's something that we will look at in ongoing calculations, I think. Thanks.
If no more, can I thank Michael again?
Thanks, Andy.